Alrighty, so welcome back. In this video, we're going to be looking at the possible relationships between unemployment and inflation. And this is brought about by looking at what they call a short-run Phillips curve. And then we're going to be looking at what happens to this relationship in the long run. So to get started, let's go ahead and draw out what an economy looks. Well, let me show you what this curve kind of looks like. So on this axis, we'll look at the price level or the inflation rate. That should be inflation rate. And on this bottom axis, we will look at unemployment. And so what this economy, Phillips, discovered is he kind of started charting out years of unemployment and inflation data. And he noticed that when inflation was high, that unemployment was generally low, and that when inflation was low over here, then unemployment was typically high. And so he kind of plotted this out, and if you draw kind of a mean curve, I guess it's then he discovered that there was this trade-off between unemployment and inflation. So let's take a look at why that is exactly. So let me clear that off real quick. So let's go ahead and draw the economy. All right, so quantity, GDP, price level, it's the long run, aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply, blah. Try that one again. Much better. Aggregate demand, full employment level, and this will be our, mercy, try that again, and that'll be our price level. Okay, and so if we look at aggregate demand and how it moves back and forth, you'll notice that if aggregate demand shifts to the right, all right, then, and so let's just say that at this full employment level of output, so YF, the inflation rate will say, price level, we'll just make up a number, is 3%, and the unemployment rate is at its natural rate, so we'll say it's at 5%. Okay? And so if aggregate demand were to shift out, whether it's through government spending, or a big jump in consumer confidence, or a big increase in wealth, any of those determinants that shift aggregate demand to the right, if any of those unexpectedly go up, we'll see this big increase in aggregate demand, and so what's going to happen? So we end up here, all right, and so we'll call that Y2. Bring that over and call that P2. All right, and so at Y2, we notice that the price level, and we'll just make up a number. We'll say that the price level, if this is 3%, we'll say this is, that's a 3. We'll say this is 5%. All right, so the price level might be 5% because it's gone up here. All right, and the unemployment rate, you'll notice if this is 5% here, then we'll say that this might be 2%. All right, and so the unemployment rate, unemployment might have dropped 2%. And so you can see that as the inflation rate went up here from 3 to 5, we had a decrease in unemployment. All right, now let's pick another color here. What if we're sitting here and something happens and the economy goes south? All right, so I don't know, maybe the housing market collapses. That might be, who would imagine that might ever happen? But anyway, and so let's say that aggregate demand shifts back to the left. All right, so you can see what happens over here, P3, and there's Y3. And so at Y3, the price level has fallen down, and we'll say, let's just make it 1%. All right, so the price level is 1%. But notice what happens to unemployment. Okay, so remember as we move this way, and remember this is the deflationary gap, it's the inflationary gap, and so as we move, our actual output is less than our potential output, and so unemployment, instead of being 5%, will make up a number and say now that it's 7%. All right, and so you can see that as aggregate demand shifts to the left, then inflation goes down, but unemployment goes up. As it shifts to the right, then inflation goes up, but unemployment goes down. And so this is where the guy Phillips came up with this curve, and it looks like this. All right, SRPC stands for short run Phillips curve. We're going to put unemployment on the bottom, and we'll put inflation on the vertical axis. And so if we were to plot this out, it'd be more of a straight line. But anyway, so you can see that high inflation, low unemployment, that's over in this area, all right? And low inflation, high unemployment, that's over in this area. This is somewhere in between. And so there is this relationship, the short run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And so this went along for a long time. In the 60s, when they plotted out the data, you know, it looked something like this, and everybody was fine with it. But then in the 1970s, something happened, all right? And that something was a dot appeared there, basically, all right? And so this really went against the idea that there was this trade-off between unemployment and inflation, because here we had high unemployment and high inflation, all right? And this is what they call stagflation, all right? So let's go on to this next slide, and that'll help us explain what's going on here. But so just in the short run, again to recap, as the aggregate demand, this is what we're moving here, as the aggregate demand shifts along a stable or non-moving short-run aggregate supply curve, that trade-off does exist. All right. And so the question is, when we got to the 70s, and Milton Friedman and his folks said, here's the big criticism of the Phillips curve, is that this shouldn't be allowed to happen. All right. So let's go over here and take a look at how that could happen. So this says, explaining this is a diagram, that the short-run Phillips curve may shift outward, resulting in stagflation. All right. And so stagflation is when you have high unemployment and high inflation, which, again, according to this, shouldn't happen, if this is correct. All right, and so the fact that it did tells us that there is this flaw with it. And so let's go ahead and draw this out again. Let's draw two of these, okay? And so this will be our Phillips curve. And, nope, not quantity. Unemployment there, and inflation here, and then we've got, let's draw the economy, so it's quantity GDP, and long run aggregate supply. It's kind of a wiggly line, but it'll be okay. Short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, there's our price level. All right, so here we are, and we know that, so let's say, remember this is our natural rate, let's say it's 5%. So I'm just going to put 5% here and give us a point of reference. All right, and so this is our Phillips curve, short run Phillips curve. Now the question is, when we were over here, we saw that that inflation went up and the unemployment rate went up. And so, whoops. So you might ask yourself, how could that happen? So looking at these curves, if aggregate demand shifts back and forth, then it's just going along this. All right, but what happens if the short run aggregate supply curve shifts? And this is what happened in the 70s because of the oil embargo, or the oil shock was the big reason. Prices of oil went up, and so energy costs rose a lot, and so the short run aggregate supply curve shifted. All right, and so that brought us to a new short run aggregate supply. And so now if we're bouncing aggregate demand back and forth along this one, change colors here, so now we're looking at this line. Now what's going to happen is when aggregate demand bumps back and forth, we're at a different reference point, because now at 5%, you know, if this were 3% inflation, now we're up to 6% inflation. All right, so let's say that was 3. So this point originally would be 3%, but now we're at, if we have unemployment level of 5%, now we're up to 6% inflation if we're here. All right, and so now that we can say, okay, here's our new short run aggregate supply curve, and let's say that this is a 5% inflation rate, and the unemployment rate went up to say 8%. All right, and so this was 6. So if we're at 5 here, and the unemployment rate's at 8%, so let's put 8 over here. And so now you can see that the seesaw motion of the short run Phillips curve is going to exist again, because now the economy is, remember, the economy wants to go back to the long run aggregate supply. All right, and so now that we have this new short run supply curve, this is what, if we plot it all out, this is what the Phillips curve is going to look like. All right, because now if we're here at 6% rate of inflation, 5% unemployment, if, this is about to get messy, so I apologize. Not that way. Let's pick black. All right. So if this is the new aggregate demand, let's say the government spending pushes us all this way. Now we have, an 8% level of inflation and, maybe a 3% level of unemployment. And so plotting it out over here, that's 8. We go over here. Wait a minute. What did I just do? 8%. Oh, and I'm sorry. And say 3 there. And so, sorry, a little brain malfunction. And so you can see that as we go along the short run supply curve, here's this. All right, and so the relationship here is when shifting, let me just write it out, when the short run aggregate supply curve shifts, it will cause the short run Phillips curve to shift in the opposite direction. Okay, let me just write over here, just a reminder that when AD shifts, bad handwriting. When AD shifts, we move along the short run Phillips curve. Okay, and so if aggregate demand shifts, all we're doing is the trade-off. And if the short run aggregate supply shifts, and so in this case it shifted left, and so we're going to move. So now we have a new frame of reference. So at 5% now our expected inflation is 6%, and so it gives us basically a new anchor. All right, and so what if short run were to shift back to the right? All right, so if short run shifted back this way, that would cause the short run Phillips curve to shift back again, because now our new full level of unemployment inflation rate would be back at 3%. All right, and so again, to recap, whenever the short run aggregate supply curve shifts either left or right, that will cause an opposite shift of the short run Phillips curve. All right, and so let's say that we had this great education bonanza, and everybody got a college degree, and everything was great. So what's going to happen over here is the short run is going to shift, and it'll actually cause that long run to shift as well. But the short run will shift to the right, which will cause the short run Phillips curve to shift to the left. And so anyway, so this is how you would use a diagram to explain that the short run Phillips curve can shift outward, so out to the right, resulting in stagflation. And again, stagflation, high unemployment and high inflation. This is what happened in the 70s, and this is what made people realize that the Phillips curve in itself was not 100% accurate. In the short run it was, but it could shift. So the question is, what happens in the long run? All right, and so this says, discuss using a diagram the view that there's a long run Phillips curve that is vertical at the natural rate of unemployment. And therefore, there is no trade-off, and here's the big one, no trade-off between unemployment rate and the inflation rate in the long run. So here's how this works. All right. So again, we'll draw the economy. And by the way, this is the last little bit. So right now we're looking at, 14 minutes. I'll be quick. All right, so price level there and there. SRAS, PL. And so this is our natural rate of unemployment. Here's a Phillips curve, short run Phillips curve. Unemployment, inflation. Okay, so we know that, let's say this happens, aggregate demand shifts out, and what's going to happen? Does the economy, remember the key is the economy basically wants to be at the level of full employment. And so if we have an inflationary gap, things will happen in the economy to pull it back. If we have a deflationary gap or recession, things will happen in the economy and it'll pull it back. And so we know that if this is the case, then generally if we have either this is monetarist inflation or this is demand pull inflation, basically not quite the same thing, but same graph. And so if this happens, we know that the inflation rate's going up, and this is going to fix itself because the short run aggregate supply curve, people are going to demand higher wages. That'll cause the short run aggregate supply curve to shift back this way. And so we have this constant interchange. If aggregate demand goes down, like this, then short run aggregate supply curve may shift because downward pressure on wages. If that's true, in the long run it might be, in the short run maybe not. But anyway, and so we know that the aggregate demand and supply shift back and forth, but they always want to get to this level of full employment. Okay, and so we can have shifts of the short run Phillips curve. Okay, but if this is our 5%, which are, again, matches up with our natural rate, then these shifts, however they go, and they can go a lot of different, bouncing back and forth, but we know that one thing, let me get a nice pretty line here to explain this. We know, I lost some of my, anyway, we know that if this is 5%, we know that the natural rate of unemployment, it's always going to hover around this number, okay, this 5%. And so this is what they mean by the long run Phillips curve. It's a vertical line because these unemployment and inflation numbers, they end up bouncing all around this line, this natural rate of unemployment, because of the market forces that will either correct for an inflationary gap or correct for a deflationary gap. They're always pushing back to this natural rate. And so that's why in the long run, the Phillips curve is this vertical line. All right. And the moral of the story is, no matter what the level of inflation, it doesn't have any impact on the unemployment rate in the long run. All right. It does in the short run, but in the long run, it always gets back to this. And so if on a test you were to show the short run Phillips curve, or just explain the trade-off between unemployment and inflation, you would do this. Short run Phillips curve, unemployment and inflation. And then if you were required to show the long run Phillips curve, this would be more AP style, they would say that, you would do that, and you would use this to explain that inflation, unemployment, this is the full employment level of output, and you would just say there's no relationship between unemployment and inflation. So short run, definitely a relationship, and remember this can shift back or forth. All right, and this shift is caused by a shift in the supply curve, short run aggregate supply curve, and so we know that there is a relationship in the short run, but in the long run it all hovers back to that because market forces take us back to full employment. So anyway, that's it. I finished up at, daggum, 18 minutes. All right, we'll get there. So that's all. Until next time.